Hello to anyone listening, and welcome to the very first episode of Odious, a podcast covering true crime, paranormal and supernatural events, with a brand new episode released every week. As this is the first episode, I think now would be a good time to properly introduce myself. My name is Shauna and I'm from Wales in the UK. I have my Masters in Criminology and I'm a violence prevention researcher by trade. So this podcast is a little bit of a busman's holiday for me, but I'm really passionate about true crime and raising awareness of these cases. I very much want Odious to portray any events covered as accurately and as sensitively as possible. I feel that often true crime content tends to treat the very real and tragic life events of human beings as little more than just a story, and I definitely do not want to be producing anything that comes off like that. Now that I've rambled enough, let's begin our first ever case, the gruesome and harrowing crimes of Jack the Ripper and the canonical 5 victims of Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly. This episode contains sensitive content. Viewer discretion is advised. If I asked you to picture London, many minds would immediately conjure up images of skyscrapers looming over political and business districts. However, in order for us to really think about the events covered, today we need to journey back to quite a different London, the 1880s, in particular the East End. To paint a picture for you, modern plumbing wasn't really a thing, illnesses like tuberculosis and cholera ran rampant, and poverty affected almost every household. The areas of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were no exception to this, and it is within these streets that 5 women unfortunately met their ends under very dire circumstances indeed between August and November of 1888. On August 31st of that year, Ann Nichols was found dead on Bucks Row in Whitechapel. Her throat had been slashed and her stomach had been mutilated to the point where her internal organs were protruding outwards. Ann was a mother and seemed to be gradually getting parts of her life back together after struggling with alcohol abuse for many years. Her funeral procession was watched by thousands. I'm sure none of them had any idea that this would be the beginning of one of the biggest mysteries of all time. 1 week after Ann's murder, 47-year-old Annie Chapman was found murdered in a similar way, this time on 29 Hanbury Street, located in Spitalfields. A witness would testify that she saw Annie with a man not far from Hanbury Street, shortly before dawn, leading many to think that this may have been the murderer. Just as the first victim, Annie had suffered a cut to the throat and a mutilated abdomen. However, this marked a real turning point in the murders, as the mutilation was so severe this time that the medical examiner actually held the belief that the killer might have had some anatomical knowledge. Annie had been disemboweled with her uterus being fully removed, which is really suggestive of the pure contempt that the killer had for women in his complete removal of the largest female reproductive organ. Near her body, over a fence, was a leather apron that police initially believed could have belonged to the killer. Police were aware, after asking around local sex workers following the first murder, of a local man who, colloquially by the sex workers, was referred to as Leather Apron. Identified as John Pizer, he had a terrible reputation for being abusive towards sex workers, and police initially found this promising that he may be the real murderer. However, he was shortly cleared, and the apron found at the scene of the murder was also found to have nothing to do with it. Annie was also a mother, like Mary, and was buried in a cemetery not too far from her. Only a few short weeks after Annie's murder, in fact quite eerily it was dated on what would have been her 48th birthday, the now infamous Dear Boss letter was written. It has long been subject to speculation from some and belief from others, but nevertheless this letter marked the first time the murderer was referred to by the Jack the Ripper moniker. The Central News Agency of London received the letter on September 27th, 2 days after its apparent composure, and it read,
"Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I say some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands, curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha.
At some point, this letter was stolen from the archives, however it was returned in 1987. 3 days after the Central News Agency received this communication, 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered in Duffiel's Yard in Whitechapel. Unlike the first two victims, though, there didn't appear to be any mutilation. However, Elizabeth did also die from her throat being slit. Many people, including the police, strongly believe that the murderer was interrupted during this attack on Elizabeth, and that is the reason for the lack of mutilation. This will make more sense when we move on to the following victim. Elizabeth was originally from Sweden and had one child. She was buried in an East London cemetery. That very same evening, the Ripper would also sadly claim his fourth and penultimate victim. 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes would be found on Mitre Square in Whitechapel. This was within walking distance of the scene where Elizabeth was discovered. As previously mentioned, police believe that the killer was interrupted during the previous attack and felt frustrated, which is why Catherine bore so many horrific injuries. She had her throat deeply cut with severe mutilation to the face, abdomen, and the removal and display of many organs and body parts, including part of her ear, bladder, and an entire kidney, the latter of which was stolen. Her striped apron was also, unsurprisingly, drenched in her own blood, but investigators noticed a piece had been torn off. Shortly after Catherine had been taken to the morgue, a police officer found the torn piece of apron a stone's throw away from the murder scene. It was laying in a doorway, and above it on a wall was graffiti that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Police grew concerned and did make note of this graffiti, but ultimately decided to remove it in a bid to try and prevent further racial and religious tension, which was already very high between Jews and non-Jews in the area. Catherine was a mother to 3 children and a devoted partner. Her resting place is in the same cemetery as Ann Nichols. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that the public only grew more concerned after learning that the killer had struck twice in one evening, only meters away from patrolling night watchmen, mind you. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for women, and particularly sex workers at the time, to have armed themselves with whatever they could. Fear would only continue to fester, though, when the Central News Agency would again receive another piece of correspondence, seemingly from the killer himself, only 2 days after the double slaying. Dubbed the Saucy Jacky postcard, there is still controversy over the authenticity of this letter, mainly due to the fact that it makes reference to details that may have already been made public by the news media. Despite this, though, it does discuss the double homicide of Elizabeth and Catherine, reading,
"I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jacky's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper."
This postcard was also at some point stolen. However, unlike the Dear Boss letter, it's still never been recovered. The streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields outwardly appeared Ripper-free for a good while, and you would have been forgiven at the time for assuming it may have all been over. And though it would remain this way for a bit, the most chilling delivery from the apparent killer would be made 2 weeks after the Saucy Jacky postcard, this time to George Lusk, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee's chairman. The letter's contents followed the same dry, sarcastic tone as usual. However, half a preserved human kidney was also received alongside it, held in a small jar of alcohol. Its origin today is still unknown, but many believe it to be part of the kidney stolen from Catherine Eddowes' body. Of all the letters, I believe believe, and ripperologists believe this one to be the most credible. The letter contained the following.
From hell, Mr. Lusk, saw. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
Almost a month would pass since the prior communication until November 9th, the date that the final confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper was found. This one is largely deemed as the most brutal of all the canonical Fives murders. In her own room located in Miller's Court in Spitalfields, 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly's body was found in a truly awful state. Her legs were spread apart, her body and face totally mutilated beyond recognition, and her organs had been removed and displayed around her body and her bedroom. No noise was reported by neighbours, but Mary Jane was reported to have been seen with a man shortly before heading into her residence that evening. Police believe that at least part of the reason for the gruesome state of this murder was due to it taking place behind closed doors, where the chances of interruption were slim. Mary Jane was the youngest confirmed victim and had so much life left to live. In accordance with her religious beliefs, she was laid to rest in a Catholic cemetery in London. All of these women were innocent and had some form of struggles, whether that be substance abuse issues, ailments and ill health, or struggles with poverty. However, there was much more to all of them and their struggles and status as victims. All of these women were daughters to someone. Many of these women were mothers to someone, but most importantly, all of them were human beings. It is unfortunate to say, but sadly, even in their death, these women have still been disrespected, and misinformation surrounds their lives to this day. It has long been reported, for example, that all victims were sex workers, and this doesn't appear to be the case. Many of this was perpetuated by the news media at the time. We also know that some of the victims' families took offence to this, including Catherine Eddowes' partner, John Kelly, who repeatedly testified at her inquest that they had had a loyal relationship, and in the several years they'd been together, he'd never known her to engage in sex work. Dr. Hallie Rubenhold, a historian and author of The Five, argues that this belief of all Jack the Ripper victims earning their living through sex work has almost become a fact by repetition. She says evidence of sex work simply wasn't there, but this has been overlooked because it isn't part of the accepted story. We know there's evidence of Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly being employed in the sex trade, but as for the remaining three victims, this claim is almost entirely unsubstantiated. I wanted to mention this, not because I believe there is anything wrong with willingly entering the sex trade, although how often this would have been willing in poverty-stricken Victorian London, I'm not too sure, but it's really important for accuracy's sake. Moving on to the investigation, the Metropolitan Police at the time embarked on their largest manhunt in history for Jack the Ripper. Even in present day, the hours and resources attached to this investigation is eclipsed only by events like the 7/7 bombings and the search for missing teenager Alice Gross. The Jack the Ripper search included over 2,000 police interviews and the detainment of over 80 suspects, sadly none of which would ever be found as the real murderer. Forensic identification techniques simply did not exist. In fact, these crimes took place almost 100 years prior to the first use of DNA fingerprinting used by police in a court of law. I think the news media also damaged the process of the investigation, as they really took advantage of the fear held over the case and the rampant anti-Semitism in Whitechapel at the time, to paint the murderer as Jewish, or at least encourage public opinion to be on the lookout for someone quote-unquote matching a Jewish description. The media weren't really getting much from the police whilst these murders took place, but they had to sensationalise something to get attention, and that's exactly what they did. They blew up the leather apron theory, and when that didn't lead to anything, they clung on desperately to the anti-Semitism they knew would sell in the socio-political climate of the time. Let's get into suspects and theories for the final part of this episode. The police had a handful of suspects that they were really interested in. However, these range from non-existent to weak to compelling in their evidence. First, we have Montague John Druitt. Honestly, the only evidence is that he abruptly disappeared and was found washed up in the Thames after committing suicide in the later part of December of 1888, which coincided with the end of the confirmed murders. Some police officers believe that because Montague had mental health issues, his death was a confession of sorts. However, he had not long lost his job, and it really wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that his suicide was connected to that. Not that there would be for any suspect due to the lack of any forensic forensic identification techniques, there's no concrete evidence linking him to the murders, and many people, including myself, consider the investigation into Druitt's involvement to be inconclusive and massively speculative. On top of that, there are some who believe that Jack the Ripper continued killing outside of the canonical 5 as the Whitechapel murderer, of which many more murders were associated with for several more years. If this is the case, although I'm not sure it is, it definitely couldn't have been Montague. Our second person of interest is Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born career criminal specialising in theft and robbery, potentially had a history of violent behaviour, but this is not confirmed, which forms really the only basis of evidence for him being a suspect in these crimes. Beyond that, no evidence links him to the murders. The third suspect is James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant who emerged as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, largely due to the alleged discovery of a diary in the 1990s that claimed to be written by him, containing confessions of the murders. There is a general consensus of heavy skepticism over this diary, as many experts believe it to be fake rather than a genuine artifact from that time. Again, and this will become a bit of a common theme, there is no substantive evidence to connect James Maybrick to the crimes of Jack the Ripper. The only thing we have to go off is, like Montague, his history of mental illness, and like Michael Ostrog, his criminal record. Veering slightly away from police-created suspects, there has been a conspiracy theory that Jack the Ripper was actually someone with connections to the royal family at the time. The theory, often referred to as the Royal or Masonic Ripper theory, basically proposes the idea that Jack the Ripper was actually a physician to the royals who was sent on a mission by Queen Victoria to murder the 5 victims as a result of them blackmailing Queen Victoria's grandson. The reason behind this is theorised to be that Victoria's grandson had an affair with a sex worker in Whitechapel or Spitalfields, who then became pregnant and had his child, leading the canonical 5 to band together and blackmail the royal family for money. The favourite suspect by sleuths for this is Sir William Gull, a royal physician to Queen Victoria. However, there is no concrete evidence linking Gull to the crimes, and he is widely regarded as an unlikely suspect, with most experts dismissing these theories as baseless and unfounded. Additionally, even more compelling, is that William had suffered a major stroke in 1887, and these became such a common occurrence over the next few years that he eventually died in 1890 due to it. It is theorised that the strokes immobilised him so much that he simply wouldn't have been able to commit 5 murders during this period. Another very prominent conspiracy theory crosses over with another true crime case, this one from over the pond. H.H. Holmes, an American serial killer known for his murder castle in Chicago, was speculated to be Jack the Ripper due to the overlapping timelines and his known propensity for very gruesome murder. The theory gained some traction because it is documented that H.H. Holmes was travelling around Europe during the period of the Ripper murders. However, there is no concrete evidence linking him to the London killings, and experts generally consider this theory unlikely. As said, the idea of Holmes as a suspect is definitely not one conjured by police, and is more of an online generated conspiracy theory largely based on speculation. One that I find particularly interesting, although I'm not sure it's very likely, is the Jill the Ripper theory. As you may have guessed from the name, this theory sets out the idea that Jack the Ripper was actually a woman. This theory gained some attention due to the idea that a female killer could evade detection more easily, and that more women were present in the East End of London during the time of the murders. The idea of a female perpetrator also arguably arose from an interpretation of certain crime scene details and motivations. However, there is no substantial evidence to support this theory, and most experts do consider it unlikely, with the traditional view still holding that Jack the Ripper was male. Finally, we come to the police and my favourite suspect that I believe is the most likely to be the Ripper, Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish immigrant and a resident of London's Whitechapel district. We know he often perpetrated violent behaviour and allegedly suffered from mental health issues. Kosminski was a barber by trade and was identified as a suspect based on eyewitness testimony claiming to have seen him near one of the crime scenes. His name was also mentioned in multiple official police documents and later on through investigations. Having said that though, there is nothing to conclusively connect him to the crimes, although as previously said there really wouldn't be based on the lack of forensic techniques available. He was also committed to a mental health home in 1891. This was a good few years following the end of the canonical 5 killings. However, something that is quite compelling where Kosminski is concerned is the Kosminski scarf. This refers to a scarf found near Catherine Eddowes at the time of her death, a scarf that allegedly belonged to Aaron Kosminski. It was purchased via auction in 2007, and in 2014 it was claimed that the scarf contained DNA evidence linking him to the Ripper's crimes via apparent traces of semen and blood DNA. However, the scarf's authenticity and validity of the DNA results have been and still are hotly debated by ripperologists, with many experts questioning the reliability of the findings and the methods used in the analysis. As a result, the scarf's role in confirming Kosminski's guilt remains highly controversial, and it's doubtful we will ever truly be able to say for sure that he was actually Jack the Ripper. With all this to say, the case is still unsolved, and it probably always will be, unfortunately. This episode has sort of coincided with the release of Unsolved Mysteries Season 4, in which their first episode also covers Jack the Ripper, and I promise this wasn't intentional. Great minds obviously just think alike. However, historians in that series at the end of the episode say something that I found so intriguing, that it's entirely possible for someone out there to hold the missing piece that could shed light on who the murderer really was. Someone might even have possession of the Saucy Jacky postcard. It could be hidden in a basement or an attic somewhere. So if you do come across anything, the website to report this is unsolved.com, and how amazing would it be if this did actually get solved? In the meantime though, my heart truly goes out to the descendants of the victims killed by Jack the Ripper, and without getting too spiritual, I really do hope that wherever the victims are, they're finally being afforded the peace and respect that they sadly didn't receive in their physical lives or after they passed. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Odious. This was a challenging one to start with, just due to the sheer amount of coverage that has already been done and the really narrow time frame and overlap that all these crimes occurred in, so I thoroughly hope you enjoyed. I also just want to make a disclaimer. I'm sorry for any audio issues. I am looking into how to step up my microphone game and improve my audio, so stay tuned for that. But I'll be back again next week, where we will be discussing the abduction and murder of John Benet Ramsey. Until then, stay sharp and stay safe.